Breaking news this hour. Russia, Turkey and Iran, three states guaranteeing now the Syrian ceasefire, have signed a memorandum today establishing 4 zones of de-escalation, as they're being termed, in the war-torn country. We'll bring you much more detail on what that's going to mean. Also ahead, leaked emails, promised rewards and a witch hunt all ensue to find out who voted for Saudi Arabia to be appointed to a UN Women's Rights Commission despite well-documented violations. And
why am I being taken out of here? This man is evil! You're evil!
A protester who was removed from a congressional hearing after laughing out loud could face jail time. Live from RTHQ, Kevin Owen with you this hour, 5 p.m. now this Thursday, and that breaking news, let me tell you about that. Russia, Turkey and Iran have signed today, a couple of hours ago, a memorandum establishing 4 zones of de-escalation, as they're being termed, in Syria. This was made possible at a new round of peace talks held in the Kazakh capital, Astana, between the Syrian government and the armed opposition. The proposal was supported by Syrian authorities, and it's aimed at strengthening the ceasefire in that long war-torn country. RT's Lizzie Phelan has the latest from Damascus.
Well, this is an important development with the signing of this memorandum of understanding by Russia, Turkey and Iran of that Russian proposal for de-escalation zones, the crux of which is essentially a freezing of the conflict between government forces and opposition forces in 4 areas. So-called moderate rebels in those areas will be charged with taking on extremist groups, internationally designated terrorist organizations like Islamic State and the Al-Qaeda affiliate formerly named Al-Nusra Front. And this plan is essentially aimed at strengthening already agreed upon ceasefires in Syria and should enable parties monitoring those ceasefires to better be able to differentiate again between the so-called moderate opposition and extremist groups. Now, supposedly, if the fighting does manage to come to a halt in those areas, then we could be seeing the establishment of no-fly zones under this proposal.
President Putin and I discussed no-fly zones and how they'll be established. It's one of the main topics on the agenda at the Astana talks, and I hope for a breakthrough.
One of the ways to strengthen the ceasefire regime is to create these safety zones, or de-escalation zones. Yesterday I discussed this issue with President Trump. As far as I understand, the American side supports the idea.
The Syrian government did initially back this proposal, although there's still major challenges. They have yet themselves to sign that memorandum of understanding, as do the opposition, who still have a long list of demands, they say, before they can agree to this proposal. So despite this important progress this afternoon, still significant challenges before we can see this proposal becoming a reality on the ground here in Syria.
Yeah, Lizzie Phelan on the ground there in Syria too, reporting for us. Now, Russia says it's ready to send observers there, adding the zones will be temporary measures for 6 months, with the possibility of extending their duration further. As we mentioned earlier, this memorandum on safe zones in Syria was agreed during the 4th round of talks held in Astana since the start of the year, trying to find a long-lasting way forward here. Emily Sue's been across more of what's happening. Let's talk about the Astana talks format. How did that all come about?
Well, Kevin, following the liberation of Aleppo at the end of last year, while Russia and Turkey, which have been staunchly backing opposing sides of the conflict in Syria, well, they've managed to come together and broker a ceasefire. And keep in mind, Russia has been backing the Syrian government forces, and Turkey, well, they have been backing some of the armed opposition forces on the ground. So they brokered a ceasefire, and that is when Russia and Turkey and Iran, they all came together and announced a fresh round of peace talks in Astana, Kazakhstan. And these 3 countries, they became guarantors of a nationwide ceasefire. Now, what's different about the Astana talks is, of course, that for the first time, representatives from both the Syrian government and armed opposition fighters on the ground, they're included and around the same table. So specific military issues can be addressed with an aim to find a political solution to the Syrian crisis. And before Astana, well, Syrian peace talks have largely been taking place in Geneva, organized by the United Nations. But none of the meetings came up with any sort of long-lasting or effective solution, partially because there was no direct negotiation between the armed opposition groups and the Syrian government in Geneva. But now with Russia, Turkey and Iran, all main players in the conflict with significant influence on both sides fighting on the ground, many are pitting their hope that this new format will come up with a new effective solution to end the 7-year conflict there. And the latest proposal put forward by Russia is to set up four de-escalation zones or safe zones in areas where the most intense fighting have been taking place in Syria. And to discuss this plan, we now are joined live by Patrick Henningsen, a global affairs analyst who's in Damascus right now. Hi there, sir. Thank you so much for joining us on RT International. So what do you expect from this new proposal of safe zones or de-escalation zones?
Yeah, I think the important thing first to point out is that this does mirror the terminology used by the United States-led proposal before of safe zones. The only difference here, the important thing to point out, is this is not being coming from the U.S. This is being led by a different coalition of countries, Russia, Iran, and we have Turkey as well in there, and some agreement from the Syrian government to support a Russian-led proposal here. That's the difference, and I think this is why it's getting some support from the Syrian government. And what they're doing is redefining, reformulating the language of this conflict away from a sort of a fabricated, inverted reality that's been used in the conversation led by Washington, the UK, France, and the other NATO states, and to some degree Turkey, and into a reality area where we're actually talking about who are the actual extremists on the ground, who are the terrorist groups, and not calling everybody who's an armed person against the government, calling them moderate rebels or armed opposition, because that's not what they are. And I think everybody in Syria knows that. I think Russians know that. There are hardcore terrorist groups operating and occupying sections of cities in Syria and parts of regions and so forth.
Now, the details of exactly where these de-escalation zones will be, how will they be controlled, all those details are very sketchy at this point. But in your opinion, how do you think these zones will be controlled by the three states, the three guarantors, that's Turkey, Iran, and Russia?
Well, there have been attempts in the past to have, organized ceasefires between the government and terrorist groups, or the government and so-called rebels, and between those groups themselves. But as we saw last week in East Ghouta, terrorist groups began fighting amongst themselves, and quite a few, many dozen, were killed in infighting, for instance. So the whole idea of getting a ceasefire to happen, that's a whole other thing altogether, and there's no guarantee of success. This might be okay on paper, and it might be a good starting point, but going forward, it really doesn't change the facts on the ground for Syrians and for the Syrian government, which is that terrorist groups are occupying parts of cities like Damascus and in places in the outskirts of Aleppo and cities like Raqqa and other places and whole regions like Idlib. So this is a great starting point, but I think we'll see how it develops. The reality on the ground is there's still terrorist groups, still armed groups, many of them getting support from foreign countries like Saudi Arabia, like Gulf states like Qatar and so forth. So it remains to be seen, exactly how this plays out. But on paper, it's certainly, it could be a positive move forward. But again, it depends on what happens on the ground, facts on the ground.
Now, we know in Astana, Turkey, Iran, and Russia, they've just signed the deal, the official memorandum on these so-called de-escalation zones. We know that the Syrian government also supports this plan, but here's how some of the opposition delegation members reacted in Astana. I just want to show you and our viewers this clip.
To stand and to take stand just behind this table. I would like also to invite the UN Special Representative. Please, Mr. de Mistura, I invite you also.
Now, we know this is just some members of the opposition, so it's not that the entire opposition delegation walked out of the meeting. But these members walked out because they're against Iran's involvement. So how do you think all of this will impact this new plan of de-escalation zones?
Well, I think the so-called opposition have been using Iran as an excuse, including supporters of the opposition in the West, have been using Iran's involvement in this conflict as some sort of, deal breaker, as it were. This is back to the liberation of Aleppo. People were complaining about this from Washington and in Europe as well, in the UK, like this was some sort of terrible thing. But the reality is this. Those groups who are at the table in Astana who are hoping for regime change in Syria, that's not likely to happen, not anytime soon. And so this is, in a way, something on their wish list. It's just not going to happen. Same with Washington, same with the European powers as well, same with the Gulf states. That's not actually going to happen, because the reality is this. The majority of people in Syria, the vast majority of the population, are behind the government and are behind the president. Whether they voted for him or not in the last election, they're supporting this president and this government because of the foreign invasion, as it were, and the foreign influence that has come and set upon this country in such a brutal way over the last 6 years. So that's not going to change. But what is important for Russia, I think, in this case, is the center of gravity has moved from Geneva to Kazakhstan, to Astana, and symbolically that means that it could put Russia and this new coalition of Turkey, Russia, and Iran on somewhat of equal footing with what's going on in Geneva. That, to me, is very, very significant. So symbolically, it's taking the center of gravity away from Europe, from Washington, from the West, and over into more eastwards. And that's, to me, the most significant part of what's going on in Astana right now. How it actually plays out, and what the devil in the detail is in terms of draft constitutions presented by Russia, and what Syria will approve or put forward themselves in terms of political reforms in the future. That all remains to be seen. That's an unknown at this point, how that's going to confirm itself. But in terms of the federal state, that in Syria, dividing the country up, certainly this is what Washington and the Western powers have wanted, was to decentralize Syria and in sort of a federal system. That's not going to be so easy, I think, from the point of view of Syrians, because at the end of the day, a lot of people, a lot of soldiers have laid their lives down to preserve the structural integrity of this country. A lot of blood has been shed, sadly. So selling a breakup of Syria the way Washington would have wanted, or the Washington-led coalition would have wanted, is not really going to sell well on the ground here in Syria. And I think this is a reality that Russia, hopefully, and other parties involved in this peace talks, they understand this very well, which is the will of the people in Syria. This is a factor that's really important. It's not factored in from the Western conversation.
Thank you so much for shedding some light on this very, very complex issue. That was Patrick Henningsen, a global affairs analyst.
All ensue to find out who voted for Saudi Arabia to be appointed to a UN Women's Rights Commission despite well-documented violations. And
Why am I being taken out of here? This man is evil. You're evil.
a protester was removed from a congressional hearing after laughing out loud could face jail time.
Signing of this memorandum of understanding by Russia, Turkey and Iran of that Russian proposal for de-escalation zones, the crux of which is essentially a freezing of the conflict between government forces and opposition forces in 4 areas. So-called moderate rebels in those areas will be charged with taking on
Live from RTHQ, Kevin Owen with you this hour, 5 p.m. now this Thursday, and that breaking news, let me tell you about that. Russia, Turkey and Iran have signed today, a couple of hours ago, a memorandum establishing 4 zones of de-escalation, as they're being termed in Syria. This was made possible at a new round of peace talks held in the Kazakh capital, Astana, between the Syrian government and the armed opposition. The proposal was supported by Syrian authorities, and it's aimed at strengthening the ceasefire in that long war-torn country. RT's Lizzie Phelan has the latest from Damascus.
Well, this is an important development with the
Breaking news this hour. Russia, Turkey and Iran, 3 states guaranteeing now the Syrian ceasefire, have signed a memorandum today establishing 4 zones of de-escalation, as they're being termed, in the war-torn country. We'll bring you much more detail on what that's going to mean. Also ahead, leaked emails, promised rewards and a witch hunt.